morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to a whole new way of thinking about fear. And if this is the first one of these videos that you're watching, I encourage you to take some time either before or after to watch the video series A Whole New Way of Thinking About Thought. And that will give you a sort of a grounding and underpinning in the understanding out of which these whole new way of thinking videos come. In this video, we're going to talk about fear, and I am not uniquely qualified to talk about fear, but I am highly qualified because I've been in a relationship with fear for as long as I can remember. We've been dating since I was 3. We are so intimately connected that I, for many years, thought of myself as a fearful person. I've had analysts talk to me about how my fear comes from past lives. I've had it explained to me that the fear of my ancestors is encoded into my DNA. I studied with somebody in the Enneagram who diagnosed me as a counterphobic 6, which meant that I lived in a constant state of fear, but I was able to overcome it through action. And all of those descriptions at various times in my life felt accurate, but not terribly helpful. Where I've gotten to in my relationship, though, is such a different place that what I wanted to do in these videos is I wanted to take you through the evolution of my relationship with fear, not so you get to know me better, but so that you can sort of look at your relationship with fear. Because it's very unlikely that you're going to go through your entire life without it. In fact, in all the time that I've worked, I've met one person who didn't understand fear, who I don't know if they had a chip missing in their brain, but they genuinely, fear was not a thing for them. It wasn't that they were brave, it wasn't that they handled it well. They literally had no idea what people were talking about when they talked about fear. So unless you're that person or that person's cousin, I'm going to assume you have a relationship with fear right now. You have a way of thinking about fear. And in sharing my story and sharing the evolution of my relationship with fear, my hope for you is that your relationship with fear improves from wherever it is now, however big or little a deal fear feels like in your life, however much or how little fear is a factor in your life, to a relationship with fear where it really is just a friend. But for me, growing up, the idea of fear as a friend was a huge leap because fear was not a friend. Fear was the enemy. And my goal in life, my mission in life, was to conquer fear and to defeat the enemy. And there was a quote from the science fiction writer Frank Herbert that I loved, and I would repeat to myself all the time. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. And even today, there's a lot about that quote I love, particularly the bit about what's left when the fear is gone. But at the time, it was all about how do I conquer this awful thing inside me called fear. And so I studied and I practiced and I learned techniques like imagining yourself inside a 50-foot puma towering over everybody. And yeah, when I kind of got into that visualization, I didn't feel scared, I felt powerful. And I did trainings on turning fear into power, where you would use your body the way you would use your body if you weren't afraid, and you would tell yourself the things you would tell yourself if you weren't afraid. Or I would do step-ins, where I would imagine somebody who wasn't afraid, and I would step into them, and I would choose people like Arnold Schwarzenegger from The Terminator. He's not afraid, and so I would sort of pretend to be Arnold Schwarzenegger and not be afraid that way. And while all of those things in some ways helped me to move forward in spite of fear, they kept my attention firmly locked on fear. Fear was what my life was about. fear overcoming fear, fear overcoming fear. And it was exhausting. And I was reasonably successful at it. In other words, I was brave, I was courageous sometimes, but often fear would get the better of me. In our daily wrestling matches, I would often wind up being the one pinned into inaction by the might of my enemy. Now, you may recognize this for yourself. You may be in, your relationship with fear may be in that fear is the enemy. And either fear is the enemy, but it's okay because you're stronger than fear, which is where I sort of was trying to always get myself to, or fear is the enemy and you're helpless against that enemy, and so you just avoid being in situations where you think you're going to be afraid. And so, for example, you might, well, I'm not going to go public speaking because public speaking is scary, or I don't like being in large groups of people because being in large groups of people is scary, or I don't want to do any physical activities that might be dangerous because that's scary, or I don't want to get intimate with somebody because that's scary. And the thing that all of those things have in common is fear becomes a reason to not do something. Fear becomes the one who's making the decisions for you. And in that instance, either fear is in charge or you're in charge. And it's a constant battle. And it's like the old story of the Cherokee elder talking to his grandson and said, there's two wolves inside me, and one of them is brave and strong, and the other one is scared and cowardly, and they fight to the death for my soul. And the grandson goes, grandfather, which one will win? And the grandfather goes, the one I feed. And I used to love that interpretation of the story as, yes, we can conquer this enemy inside. And yet, what if fear isn't the enemy? What if fear is something else? And that inquiry into the nature of fear began to change my relationship with fear. And I started to see that fear is less to do with a particular activity or a particular environment than it is to do with what I'm thinking about in the moment. And I found it quite easy to see because I could see that if I looked at a picture of a spider, I would get scared. And I knew logically, well, that picture can't hurt me, but it felt like it could. And I started to get a little bit more suspicious of fear. And so my relationship changed from this is a thing and it is my enemy to, maybe this is more a trick of the light than a physical thing that has to be conquered. And I got very interested in the nature of fear, and I learned a technique from NLP called the phobia cure, or the VK dissociation, where you would learn to separate out the visual image from the feeling that the visual image evoked in you. And I began to see that fear, like so many of my other emotions, was made more of thought than of reality. And it reminded me of that expression that I'm sure you've heard, the acronym FEAR, that fear is just false evidence appearing real. Well, essentially, fear is simply thought appearing real. It's STAR. It's images in our own mind that scare us. And I sort of see, well, if fear is just coming from my own mind, and my mind is always going to be thinking, then if I happen to be thinking about something scary, then I'm going to be scared. And if I'm not thinking about something scary, I won't be scared. And it was independent of circumstance. So sometimes I would be in a circumstance that I used to think of as scary, but for whatever reason that day I wasn't thinking scary thoughts, so I wouldn't be scared. And then other times I would be in a situation where it was innocuous. I remember for a long time, I would, if I raised my hand in a group, my heart would be thumping and I'd start to sweat. And I was like, oh my God. And I could just see, this is more random than I thought it was. And fear began to go from being the enemy to becoming almost a curiosity, almost an irrelevance. Because I started to see, well, if fear is is sort of being made up in the moment, then sometimes it's going to be there and sometimes it isn't. And it's not really predictable. So I don't really need to take it into account in the same way. I don't need to pre-decide, I'm not going to do that because that's going to be scary, because I don't know if it's going to be scary for me or not in the moment, because I don't know what thoughts are going to be running through my head in the moment. And so it's almost as though somebody saying to me that, well, I can't do this activity because it's too scary, is like saying, well, I can't do this activity if there's anybody around wearing a red t-shirt. Because if there's somebody there with a red t-shirt, I'm gonna freak out. But if there's nobody there with a red t-shirt, I'll be fine. Well, at some point you start to see that it doesn't really matter if there's someone there with a red t-shirt or not. And so in that sense, over time, my relationship with fear went from fear is my enemy to fear is an irrelevance. Fear is something that is sometimes there, sometimes not, somewhat random and arbitrary, and not something I really need to factor into my plans. And that seemed to me to be a very healthy relationship with fear. And I certainly spent more time fearing less, being fearless. So in some ways, less time being brave and conquering fear with my courage and bravery, and more time just sometimes being scared and sometimes not, and not particularly having a preference for either or. And that seemed to me to be as good as it was going to get. I was very happy with that. And then one day I had a conversation with a friend, and I was back in one of my habitual fears, because fear is made of thought. We have habitual thoughts, so we have habitual fears. And I was back in one of my habitual fears, and it was looking a little, that false evidence was looking pretty damn real. And they said to me, what do you think fear is? And I, by now, had a very practiced rap about what fear was, and I could explain it to them. I said, well, fear is a biological mechanism to preserve our safety and well-being. It's an awareness of a clear and present danger that releases adrenaline into the bloodstream and voids our bowels so that we can run faster or fight stronger, and it's like a temporary shot of power that we can use to deal with saber-toothed tigers. But the problem is that because we can react to our own thinking, false evidence, in the same way as to a clear and present danger, we're continually feeling these scary feelings, and I just went on. And it was all incredibly logical, and some of it may even have been biologically accurate, but I could tell that she was unimpressed, that this did not wow her. I was not blinding her with my science. And I said to her, what do you think fear is? And she said, thought. And I had a little epiphany. Because on the one hand, I kind of knew it was made of thought, because I'd done VK dissociations, and I had seen that it came and went, and it didn't have anything to do with a particular situation. But I still was looking at it as a very real thing that I had to fight against or ignore. In that moment, I started to see fear's not even